All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are going deep into the world of cryptography.
Ooh, cryptography.
Yeah, we're going to tackle a concept that I bet you've heard of, but maybe don't fully understand.
I bet a lot of people think they understand it, but it's a little more nuanced than they think.
Yeah, it's called non-repudiation.
Non-repudiation, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but basically it boils down to this. How do we make sure that when we send information online, the person receiving it knows for sure that it came from us and hasn't been tampered with?
That's the million-dollar question. How do we trust anything on the internet?
Yeah, it's like the digital equivalent of signing a contract in ink.
Exactly.
So to help us break this down, we are using Professor Messer's Security Plus training as our guide.
He's the guru.
He is the guru, and he kind of lays it out in two key ideas: proof of integrity and proof of origin.
Two sides of the same coin.
I like that. Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
So let's start with integrity. What does that even mean when we're talking about the digital world?
Okay, well, let's imagine you're downloading a huge file.
Like a movie or something.
Even bigger. Think like a massive encyclopedia from Project Gutenberg.
Okay, so like an ebook.
Yeah, like an ebook.
Right.
And Professor Messer actually uses this in his example. It's 8.1 millibit of text.
Wow, that's a lot of information.
It's hefty.
Yeah.
So how do you know that what you downloaded is actually what was originally uploaded and that nobody's messed with it along the way?
Right. Like, how do we know that every sentence, every word, every paragraph is exactly the same?
Exactly. And that's where hashing comes in.
Hashing.
Hashing, yeah. So basically, it's like creating a unique digital fingerprint for that data.
Okay.
And even a tiny change, like adding or deleting just one character, will completely change that fingerprint.
No way. So even like a comma.
Even a comma.
Wow.
He actually tested it.
Really?
Yeah, he changed one character in that giant encyclopedia, and the hash, that digital fingerprint, was totally different.
So it's like magic.
Well, it feels like magic. But it's actually really clever math that makes sure that any change, no matter how small, is detected.
So if the hash of my downloaded file matches the one that the source provides, I can be sure that it's the real deal.
Exactly. It's like a seal of authenticity.
That is so cool. And so this is used everywhere, right?
It's everywhere. It's how we verify software updates.
Oh, right.
It's how we make sure bank transactions are secure. It's all happening behind the scenes thanks to those digital fingerprints.
Okay, so that's proof of integrity. So we know the data hasn't been messed with. But how do we know where it came from in the first place?
Right.
That it actually came from the person or organization it's supposed to be from?
And that's where proof of origin comes in.
Okay.
And the tool we use for that is a digital signature.
So it's like signing a contract, like you're linking your identity to that document.
Exactly, you got it.
Okay, but how does that work in the digital world? Does my computer have a tiny pen it signs things with?
Not quite. It's all about encryption.
Encrypt.
Yeah, so imagine Alice wants to send Bob a message,
Okay.
like a job offer or something.
Right.
And she wants to make it official, so Bob knows for sure it's from her.
Right, so he knows it's really her and not some scammer or something.
Exactly. So first, Alice's computer creates a hash of the message. So remember that digital fingerprint we were talking about?
Uh-huh.
Then it encrypts that hash using her private key.
Your private key.
Yeah, that's like a secret code that only she knows.
Okay.
And that encrypted hash becomes the digital signature.
Okay, so it's like she's sealing that message with her own special stamp or something.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, what happens next?
So Bob gets the message and the signature,
Okay.
and he uses Alice's public key, which anyone can have, to decrypt the signature,
Right.
revealing the original hash.
Okay.
Then Bob's computer runs the message through the same hashing algorithm.
And that creates...
Another hash. And then he compares the two fingerprints.
So if they match perfectly, Bob knows for sure Alice sent it.
Precisely. It's like a digital locking key.
Oh, that makes sense.
That's non-repudiation in action. It's undeniable proof of origin because Alice can't deny sending that message. Only her private key could have created that specific signature.
Wow, this is making me think twice about every email I've ever sent.
I know, right? It's pretty amazing.
So all this cryptography is happening behind the scenes whenever I digitally sign something.
All the time.
It's protecting me from fraud and building trust in a world that increasingly relies on digital communication. So proof of integrity confirms the data hasn't been messed with.
Right.
Proof of origin verifies who sent it.
Exactly.
And together they create this digital fortress of trust non-repudiation.
Boom.
I love it. But as with any fortress, I'm guessing there are some vulnerabilities.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll get into that later. But before we do, I'm curious about some real-world implications here. I mean, how is non-repudiation actually used to protect people?
Okay, well, let's take the example of digital contracts. So when you sign a contract online, that's non-repudiation in action because you can't later claim that you didn't agree to those terms.
So it's like a digital handshake that's legally binding.
Exactly.
Got it. So it's not just for contracts, right?
No, not at all.
It's like online banking and e-commerce,
Yeah.
even things like secure email communication.
It's everywhere. And it's working behind the scenes all the time to make sure there's trust and accountability in the digital world.
I had no idea how much I relied on this concept without even knowing it.
I know, right? Most people don't.
Well, this is all pretty amazing, but I'm starting to wonder what happens when things go wrong.
Oh.
Like, if there's a disagreement over a digitally signed document, how does non-repudiation hold up in court, in the real world?
Ooh, that's a great question. And that's where things get really interesting. You see, a digital signature can actually be presented as evidence in court, just like a physical signature.
Really?
Yeah, it's basically a tamper-proof record that shows that a document came from a specific person and that it hasn't been altered.
So it's like having a digital witness to that agreement.
Exactly. The digital signature is that witness. But of course, things aren't always that black and white.
What do you mean? What else is there?
Well, imagine someone claims that their private key was stolen.
Oh.
They could argue that someone else used their key to forge the signature and that they never actually agreed to anything.
So it's like saying someone forged your signature on a paper contract.
Precisely.
Hmm.
So it's not a foolproof system. The strength of non-repudiation really hinges on the security of those private keys.
That makes sense. So what happens then? Does the whole system just fall apart?
Not necessarily. Basically, the burden of proof shifts to the person making that claim.
Oh, so they have to prove that their key was stolen.
Exactly.
That sounds tricky.
Yeah, it can be. Investigators might look for signs of hacking on their computer, or they might look at the timing and circumstances of when and how that theft allegedly happened.
So it becomes a bit of a digital detective story then.
You could say that, and this is where digital forensics comes in.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
But this really highlights how important it is to protect those private keys, like it's the key, no pun intended, to the whole system.
It's like guarding the keys to your digital kingdom.
It's interesting. This whole conversation is making me realize how much we take trust for granted in the physical world.
Right.
Like if you think about signing a document, with a pen, you don't really think about the possibility of someone stealing your pen and forging your signature.
Right.
But in the digital world, that's a real threat.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's almost like we need to be even more vigilant in the digital realm.
Yeah, the stakes are higher in some ways because the tools for deception are so much more advanced.
And speaking of more advanced tools, you mentioned earlier that there are new technologies emerging that could offer even stronger ways to ensure non-repudiation.
Yeah.
And you hinted at blockchain, right? Everyone's talking about blockchain these days.
Yeah, blockchain is a game changer for sure.
So how would it help with non-repudiation? In a nutshell.
Okay, so basically blockchain is like a digital ledger that's distributed across a whole network of computers.
Okay.
So that makes it virtually impossible to alter or to hack.
So it's like a permanent, unchangeable public record of every single transaction.
Exactly. And because of that, it's incredibly powerful when it comes to non-repudiation.
How so?
Well, imagine a digital contract stored on a blockchain.
Okay.
Once it's there forever. Nobody can deny they signed it or try to change the terms after the fact.
That sounds like it could revolutionize how we think about agreements and contracts and things like that.
I think it already is.
Wow, this is blowing my mind.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah, but hold on. If it's a public record, doesn't that raise some privacy concerns?
You're right. That's a great question. And
Yep.
it really highlights how important it is to balance security and privacy.
Right.
Because not all blockchains are public. There are private and permissioned blockchains where access is restricted.
Oh, okay.
So that addresses some of those concerns.
So it's about choosing the right type of blockchain for the right job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's also about being mindful of those trade-offs.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that these technologies are implemented in a way that protects our security, but also respects our privacy.
This has been a fascinating journey so far. We've covered so much from like the technical nuts and bolts of cryptography
Right.
to the legal implications,
Right.
even ethical considerations, which we're going to get into more later.
Definitely.
It's amazing how much this seemingly simple concept of non-repudiation touches so many different aspects of our lives.
It really does.
Yeah.
And I think this just underscores why it's so important to have these conversations and to really educate ourselves about these technologies.
I agree. The more we understand, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this increasingly complex digital world. You know, as we're talking, I'm realizing that non-repudiation isn't just about security and trust.
What do you mean?
It's also about power.
Ooh, interesting.
Because whoever controls the keys, whoever controls the technology, ultimately has a lot of power because they can decide who's accountable, who's believed, whose voice gets heard.
That's a really good point.
It makes me think about things like online censorship, digital surveillance, even the spread of misinformation. It all ties back to this idea of control and trust in the digital world.
You're right. And it really highlights the need for transparency and accountability, to have really strong ethical frameworks to govern these technologies. Because we want to make sure that they're being used to empower people, not to control them or silence them.
I love it when our conversations get deep like this. I'm going to be thinking about this long after we're done recording.
Me too.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but I know there's still so much more to explore.
Definitely.
We'll be right back after a quick break to wrap up our deep dive into non-repudiation with some final thoughts. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how non-repudiation works in the real world, and I'm still curious about what happens when there's a disagreement.
Right.
Maybe someone claims they didn't actually sign a digital contract or something. Can non-repudiation really hold up in court?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You see, a digital signature can actually be presented as evidence in court, just like a physical signature.
Really?
Yeah. It's basically like a tamper-proof record that shows the document came from a specific person and hasn't been altered in any way.
So it's like having a digital witness to the agreement.
You got it. The digital signature is that witness.
No. Okay.
But of course, things aren't always so black and white.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine someone claims that their private key was stolen.
Oh, okay.
They could argue that someone else used their key to forge that signature and that they never actually agreed to anything.
So it's like saying someone forged your signature on a paper contract.
Exactly. So, like we said, it's not a foolproof system, right?
Mm.
The strength of non-repudiation really depends on how secure those private keys are.
That makes sense. So what happens then? Does the whole system just fall apart if someone says, oh, my key was stolen?
Well, not necessarily. Basically, the burden of proof shifts to the person making that claim.
So they have to prove that their key was stolen.
Exactly.
That could be tough.
It can be, yeah. Like, investigators might look for signs of hacking or malware on their computer, or they might examine, the timing and circumstances of the alleged theft.
So it becomes a bit of a digital detective story then.
Yeah, you could say that.
And this is where digital forensics comes in.
Exactly.
That is so fascinating. But this really highlights how important it is to protect those private keys.
Absolutely.
Like it's really the key to the whole system.
It's like guarding the keys to your digital kingdom.
You know what? This whole conversation is making me realize how much we take trust for granted in the physical world.
Right.
Like when you think about signing a document, with pen and paper, you don't really think about the possibility of someone stealing your pen and forging your signature.
Right.
But in the digital world, that's a real threat.
It's a constant threat.
So it's almost like we need to be even more vigilant in the digital realm because the tools for deception are that much more sophisticated.
Absolutely. The stakes are much higher.
And speaking of more advanced tools, you mentioned earlier that there are new technologies emerging that could offer even stronger ways to ensure non-repudiation.
Yeah.
And you hinted at blockchain, right? Everyone's talking about blockchain these days.
Blockchain is definitely a game changer.
So how would it work with non-repudiation, just like in a nutshell?
Okay, so basically blockchain is like this digital ledger, and it's distributed across a whole network of computers.
Yeah.
So that makes it virtually impossible to tamper with, to hack.
So it's like this permanent, unchangeable public record of every single transaction.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And that's why it's so powerful for non-repudiation.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Because imagine like a digital contract that's stored on a blockchain.
Okay.
Once it's there forever, right? No one can deny that they signed it. No one can try to change the terms after the fact.
That sounds like it could completely revolutionize the way we think about agreements and contracts.
It already is.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. But hold on, if it's a public record, doesn't that raise some privacy concerns?
You're right. That's a great question. And it highlights how important it is to think about the balance between security and privacy. Because not all blockchains are public.
Right.
There are private and permissioned blockchains where access is restricted,
Okay.
which can address some of those concerns.
But it's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
And making sure it's implemented in a way that protects people.
Yeah, we have to be mindful of the trade-offs, right? We want to make sure that these technologies protect our security, but also respect our privacy.
This has been such a fascinating journey.
It has.
We've gone from the really technical nuts and bolts of cryptography to the legal implications of all of this. Even touched on some ethical considerations, which I definitely want to dive into a little bit more. It's amazing how much this concept of non-repudiation touches so many different parts of our lives.
It really does.
Yeah.
And I think this just shows how important it is to have these conversations.
Yeah.
To educate ourselves about how these technologies work.
I agree. The more we understand, the better we can navigate this increasingly complex digital world. As we're talking, I'm realizing that non-repudiation isn't just about security and trust. It's also about power.
Interesting. How so?
Because whoever controls the keys, whoever controls the technology, ultimately has a lot of power, right? They can determine who's accountable, who's believed, whose voice is heard.
That's a good point.
Makes me think about things like online censorship, digital surveillance, even the spread of misinformation.
Oh, yeah?
It all ties back into this idea of control and trust in the digital world.
It really does. And it highlights the need for transparency and accountability, for strong ethical frameworks around these technologies.
Yeah, I like that.
We have to make sure they're being used to empower people and not to control them or to silence them.
I'm loving how deep this conversation is getting.
Me too.
I'm going to be thinking about this long after we're done recording today.
Me too.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but I know there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah. We've only just scratched the surface.
We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up our deep dive into non-repudiation with some final thoughts for everyone.
All right, we're back, and my head is spinning after all that. We went from digital fingerprints to blockchain, from courtrooms to, the balance of power in this digital age. It's a lot.
I know. It's amazing how one concept, non-repudiation, can take us down so many different paths.
It really is. But, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about non-repudiation being all about building trust in this digital world we live in.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the foundation that so much of our digital lives are built upon. Because without some way to verify things, to make sure things are authentic, and to ensure accountability, the internet would be a scary place.
Yeah, it'd be like the Wild West out there, right? Digital outlaws running around doing whatever they want. Exactly. No online banking, no e-commerce, no secure communication, none of the things that we take for granted now.
Yeah, it would be chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah.
So non-repudiation is really that invisible force that brings order to the chaos and allows us to interact online with confidence.
I like, though, it's like the digital equivalent of the rule of law, right? Making sure things are fair and that we can resolve disputes.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
So as we move even further into this digital age with things like, AI, the metaverse and all that, what role do you think non-repudiation will play?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because as technology evolves, so will the challenges to trust and accountability.
Right.
So we're going to need even more sophisticated tools and frameworks to ensure non-repudiation in those, new digital landscapes that we're creating.
It's hard enough to prove things in the real world sometimes. Imagine trying to prove, who did what in a virtual world where identities can be fluid and actions are even harder to track.
Right. It's going to be tricky. But it really underscores how important those core principles are. Proof of origin, proof of integrity, and finding that balance between security and privacy.
So if there's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this whole conversation, what would it be?
That non-repudiation is not just some abstract technical term. It's something that affects everyone who uses the internet.
Yeah.
So by understanding how it works, we can all be more informed and we can be better digital citizens, right? We can protect ourselves better.
That's a great point. It's like learning the rules of the road before you get behind the wheel of a car.
Exactly.
You don't necessarily need to know how the engine works, but you need to understand the basics of how to stay safe and how to, navigate the roads.
And it's the same with the digital world. Understanding how non-repudiation works can help us navigate that world more safely and confidently.
To wrap it all up, Non-repudiation is about establishing trust, it's about making sure people are accountable for their actions, and it's about protecting ourselves in this increasingly digital world.
I love it. It's about creating a digital environment where our interactions are secure, they're reliable, and they're fair.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating world of non-repudiation.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it?
I've learned a lot. I hope everyone listening has too.
Me too.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep diving deep.